Okay, the early republic, the period from 1796 to 1804. Okay, now guys, the period after George Washington's term, they were basically a time filled with paranoia. I mean, we'd never done something like this. And the Federalists were afraid they were losing power to the Republican Democrats. So in turn, they carry out confused domestic and international policies. And their defense was basically, look, the Republican Democrats are crazy. They made us do it. Ready to go to the next slide? Conflict in the Adams administration. Oh, let me raise this up a little bit. Now, the split election of 1796. The Republicans, Democrats, they ran Thomas Jefferson for president, Aaron Burr for vice president. Both of these guys shared a belief in democracy and republicanism. I mean, they were both revolutionary veterans. Aaron Burr, although he was an orphan, he was the grandson of famous evangelical leader Jonathan Edwards, but he chose to pursue the law instead of the ministry. He accepted a commission with the revolutionaries and joined the Sons of Liberty, who in 1786 called themselves the Society of St. Tammany. This society was basically a political machine that was very influential in the election of Andrew Jackson and would later evolve into Tammany Hall. But Burr was a very passionate man, focused, directed, and quick to anger. So that's the Republican Democrats. What about the other side? Well, the Federalists, they were divided between two different candidates for president. Hamilton, who was kind of like the granddaddy of the Federalist Party, he favored Thomas Pinckney. And he believed that the treaty had worked out, would make him very popular in the South as well as in the West. So he believed that he was such a shoo-in that he encouraged Electoral College voters who were voting for John Adams not to vote for him. And of course, because of Hamilton's scheming ways, to elect Pinckney, it basically led to a lot of the Electoral College throw their vote and vote for Thomas Jefferson instead. So you have the president of our nation, who was John Adams, and his vice president was a member of the other party, Thomas Jefferson. Ready for the next slide? Indeed, Jefferson only got 3 less votes than Adams did. And Adams showed very few conciliatory gestures to try to bring partisan peace between the two parties. I mean, like, he kept 3 strong Federalist cabinet members and refused to appoint James Madison to be ambassador to France. Oops, what's the music? Well, basically, speaking of France, they could see that there was a lot of division in the nation. So they tried to take advantage of this division by doing things like cutting off our relations because of the Federalist pro-British stance. Also, they began to seize American ships. Which, of course, isn't cool with us. So we send 3 envoys to France. Ready for the next slide? Two of which were Monroe and C.C. Pinckney. And basically, when we get over there, we get involved in what's called the XYZ affair. And that basically, when we get over there, we talk to the first guy. He says, hey, give me a bribe of like $100,000 and I'll introduce you to the next guy. You'll basically pay him $150,000 and then you'll be introduced to the French foreign minister, Talleyrand, and you give him a bribe of $250,000 and agree to loan $12 million to France, and we'll start up negotiations with you. And here you can basically see an editorial cartoon of that. Here's America throwing their money at France. There's John Bull, who is kind of like, as Uncle Sam is to the United States, John Bull was to the British. And he's looking down at this and laughing. And of course, here in America, we totally refuse to do that. Indeed, you have a whole quasi-war with France began, where we kind of get into a war footing. I mean, there's a navy that's created. We authorize a standing army. And you did have some hostilities that broke out at sea, even though you didn't have any on land. And the Federalists and Republican Democrats are totally split over how to treat this. The Federalists, of course, want full-scale war. The Republican Democrats don't. Ready to go to the next slide? Well, like I said, the Federalists really have no idea how to treat the Republican Democrats. Because once again, you know, President George Washington warned us about having other political parties. You know, it was odd for them to have a party that was against what they stood for. So Congress enacted some legislation to weaken the Republican Democrats. They wanted to do it by countering the influence of immigrants. Like they passed the Naturalization Act that extended the residency requirements for citizenship from 5 to 14 years. And now that it took people longer to become a citizen, they passed the Alien Act that said that the president could deport foreigners identified as posing a threat to the United States. And I love it. The ink isn't even dry on the Constitution and Bill of Rights yet they passed the Sedition Act that outlawed criticism of the government or its officials. And utilizing this act, 15 Republican Democrat newspaper editors were prosecuted underneath the Sedition Act. Well, how are the Republican Democrats going to respond to this? Well, basically, the Republican Democrats' response was to pass the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. James Madison wrote the Virginia resolutions. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Kentucky resolutions. Basically, these asserted that the states could declare a federal law void. Starting to give rise to states' rights, which back in this period of America's development were very, very strong. Y'all ready to go to the next slide? Well, because we had basically now had to build a navy, had to pay for a standing army, that cost the federal government about $2 million. And they divided it amongst the states over how much the states had to contribute back to the federal government. And in Pennsylvania, they had to contribute $237,000. And basically, in order to pay back that money, they passed customs duties and land taxes. Indeed, they had one thing called the window tax that basically, based on how big your windows were, you would have to pay a larger tax the bigger the window. And of course, because it was the federal government and they had to follow due process, they'd have to measure those windows. And you had some homes where the guys in the top window, first off, they wouldn't let the guys into their houses to measure the top windows. And they knew that these people were coming, so they'd have a pot of water on the stove. And they'd fill up a hot water bottle with it, and they'd dump out the boiling water on the guys trying to measure the windows. And basically you have a guy by the name of James Freeze who gets up and he starts a rebellion. That goes around basically and frees prisoners that have been arrested for not paying the taxes, as well as trying to prevent the officials from collecting the taxes. Well, this movement gets broken up by federal troops, and you had a total one of 41 of the men arrested and lived to be tried in court. John Freeze was found guilty, and two others, was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. You ready to go to the next slide? Well, the costs and everything of going to war with France were causing a lot of problems with some of the Americans over here. And a civilian by the name of George Logan, whose dad had been a secretary to like William Penn, he basically was able to make contact with the French government in search for a peaceful solution. He's able to get a contact. He brings that back to Adams and says, hey, we can get a peace with them. And Adams decided to pursue Logan's opening. And the U.S. and France agreed to end hostilities, which was a lot more popular with the American people, but it totally widens the gap between him and Hamilton. Ready to go to the next slide? Well, then we have the Revolution of 1800. Now, guys, do we have a lot of revolutions in America? We do. We may not think of it, but guys, every single election, you have an opportunity to throw out the old government officials and put in new ones. Now, they're not bloody, thank goodness, but basically this was the election of 1800. Ready to go to the next slide? The lesser of Republican evils. Basically, once again, the Federalists are split internally. Hamilton, he sought Adams' defeat as president. And Hamilton wanted C.C. Pinckney to be elected. Basically, he was a devout Federalist from South Carolina. And he had been at the Constitutional Convention. Meanwhile, again, because of Hamilton's scheming ways, things are thrown into confusion. Jefferson attracted the Southern vote and was able to steal many Federalist votes. Jefferson's running mate, Aaron Burr, who was supposed to be the vice president, attracted Northern Federalists, who were the small farmers and craftsmen, which ends up in a real weird situation. Ready to go to the next slide? Basically, the election is a tie. Both Jefferson and Burr win the same amount of votes. And Jefferson says, Burr, you need to go ahead and let me be president. I'm the one who was supposed to be president. And Burr says, what are you talking about? We got the same amount of votes. The people have spoken. They want me. Well, whenever you have a confusion like that in the election, it's thrown to the House of Representatives. Even today. And the House of Representatives, they take a vote, which ends in a tie. They take another vote, which ends in another tie. They take they're getting ready to take the third vote. Virginia and Pennsylvania had both mobilized their state militias to prevent a legislative usurpation of the election. Hamilton comes out, and even though he did not like Jefferson, he hated Aaron Burr even more. He said, look, Jefferson, at least we know, is a man of property, and Hamilton is the most dangerous man in the community. Another vote's taken. This time Thomas Jefferson wins, and they pass the 12th Amendment. The 12th Amendment basically says that the president and vice president have to appear as such on the same ticket. So it'll do away with any more kind of confusion in the future. Ready to go to the next slide? Federalist defenses and Loyalist opposition. Well, guys, the outgoing Federalists controlled Congress was really freaked out, so they tried to consolidate Federalist control of the judiciary by passing the Judiciary Act of 1801 that created all these new judicial positions, like 16 new federal judgeships, 6 new circuit courts, with its level of clerks and their supports, so that they could at least control one part of the government from the insanity that they thought the Republican Democrats were going to unleash. Jefferson, meanwhile, he sought reconciliation with the Federalists. In his inaugural address, he claimed, "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." He wanted to rebuild the Republic. He advocated for free speech for the party out of power. And you start to have this concept of the loyal opposition. The loyal opposition says that basically, if there's another group out there that's against you, they're not going to try to destroy the U.S. They just have different ideas. And basically, the Alien and Sedition Acts were set to expire shortly after the election in an attempt to get more people to vote for the Federalists, because if you get them back in, then basically they'll pass the Alien and Sedition Acts. Well, how did Jefferson treat it? Jefferson just put it in his pocket, didn't say anything about them, and they expired. So they simply faded away. Ready to go to the next slide? Madison versus the midnight appointments. Okay, now one of the very first things that the incoming Republican Democrats did was they wanted to end the Federalist control of the courts. So they repealed the Judiciary Act of 1801, replacing it with the Judiciary Act of 1802. Basically, they said the new judiciary was too large, too expensive, and they went about terminating the judgeships that the Judiciary Act of 1801 had created. Ready to go to the next slide? Now this is where we get James Madison, because right before they left office, basically the Adams administration put the letters that were going to go out to the new judges that were created by the Judiciary Act of 1801, they gave it to James Madison to deliver those letters. Well, Madison wasn't going to deliver them, so he didn't. And one of the guys who was supposed to be appointed one of the new justices, William Marbury, sues James Madison. Now, why did Marbury do that? Well, basically, Marbury had to pay the expenses of moving to where his new court was going to be. He had to pay for his family, everything like that. He was expecting this, And it didn't happen. And so he sues. Well, this case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. Ready to go to the next slide? And be heard by Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, who basically establishes in this case the doctrine of judicial review. The doctrine of judicial review says that it was the federal, not state courts that decided about the constitutionality of laws. And basically, he couldn't punish non-delivery of a letter. So it was ruled an unconstitutional argument. Now, this decision of putting federal courts in supremacy pretty much makes the Kentucky and Virginia resolves moot, which means that no, the states cannot declare a federal law null and void. But nobody really rules on that at this time. So this whole states' rights thing is allowed to continue to fester. And now that the Republican Democrats have gotten rid of the new courtship that was going to be created, they start going after some of the Federalist judges. Next slide. The war on the courts. Now, if you're going to be going and trying to be removing appointed judges, you're going to go after the easy targets first. And the easy target on this was John Pickering. He was from New Hampshire. He was an alcoholic who suffered mental illness. Indeed, he was so unstable and devoutly anti-Republican Democrat that even the staunchest Federalists couldn't argue against his removal. He was found guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors, impeached, and removed from office. Well, they got rid of that guy so they could establish the precedent that it could be done. So the next guy they go after is Samuel Chase. Now, Chase had been a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a staunch Federalist. He was the one who had condemned James Freeze to death and found some newspaper editors guilty under the Sedition Act. Well, Thomas Jefferson, though, was confident. His vice president, Aaron Burr, was going to be presiding over the hearing. So a lot of the Republican Democrats thought they would have no problem finding Chase guilty. Burr, however, surprised everyone by having nonpartisan hearings that allowed Chase to deliver his own testimony and evidence. And of course, because he was able to provide evidence, he's found not guilty. Ready to go to the next slide? So what was Thomas Jefferson's vision and wants for America? Republicanism in action. Ready for the next slide? Basically, Thomas Jefferson's vision for America, he wanted to shift away from the publicly supported industrial market created by Adams. He wanted to create a republic founded on simple yeoman farmers who were beholden to nobody. These were just farmers, don't have slaves. It's just them and nature. For it was these guys that Thomas Jefferson believed could make political decisions based on sound judgment and sense. Because if we were rural, then basically the evils of overpopulation and large cities could be avoided. If we needed manufactured goods, they could be imported from Europe in return for American produce. They believe the government should stay away from shaping the economy on behalf of business. And free trade would benefit both America and Europe. Now this is a huge plan. How's it going to be put into action? Well, in order to put this plan into action, he got a lot of help from his Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin. And basically, they wanted to make America debt-free by 1817. Now, guys, that is a huge dream. Well, how is he going to do it? Well, you can either raise taxes to get more revenue, or you can cut back on how much you're spending. He decided to cut back on how much he's spending. He had huge budget cuts. Like he closed some of the embassies overseas, reduces the staff, puts an end to the fancy receptions that the government put on. He cuts the military in half, reducing the army from 4,000 men to 2,500. The Navy he reduces from 25 ships to a mere 7. Indeed, Jefferson thought, because we're going to have free trade and be everybody's friend, all we really need to do is have, like, river ships to protect our home commerce. Now, needless to say, this approach put more of the responsibility of the development of the economy into private hands. And while this policy may have been very popular domestically, internationally, difficulties arose. All right, y'all ready to go to the next slide? Okay, and I talked about how internationally things were complicated. Well, the first area we'll talk about is with our good old friends, the Barbary Pirates. Now, if you remember, we had already had experience with these guys underneath George Washington. Pirates that lived basically, this was called the Barbary Coast in Africa, their capital at Tripoli there. And basically, underneath George Washington, we'd paid them a lump sum payment of $642,000. And every year we'd have to pay them $21,600 to basically as a payoff, so they wouldn't attack our ships. Now that may not sound like a lot, especially when you compare it to other European nations. Like England, they paid 250,000 pounds. France paid 100,000 francs. Denmark, Sweden, and Venice, all of them paid about $30,000 yearly. So the city-state of Venice paid more in tribute than we did. But back then, America was such an economically new that $21,500 or $600 was 1/5 of our annual budget. And we believed that it was just a waste of money. So we don't pay them the money. They declare war on us. So Thomas Jefferson sends a naval squadron out there in 1801, making him the first American president to dispatch military troops abroad. And basically, I'm really going to kind of shut it down or condense it down. The first commander of the squadron chased around their ships a lot. He was bottled up for about 6 months at Gibraltar, which is right here at the edge of the Mediterranean Sea, because all their ships were in there. But basically, they had paid fishermen to take them back to Tripoli in the hulls of their vessels, and we didn't figure that out until 6 months later. And basically, we chased them all around. One of our biggest ships, the Philadelphia, was chasing a smaller vessel that knew the waters, and it hits the shallows and becomes stuck. Well, they tried to overthrow all the cannons, overthrow all the provisions, everything like that, but they couldn't lighten it enough to get it off the bottom of the sea. So they said, we'll come here tomorrow and we'll finish the job. Well, that night a storm happened, and basically it lifted the boat off the sea floor. So the next morning the Barbary pirates took it and just used ropes to pull up the cannons, and they took it back to their capital there at Tripoli. And basically, we can't stand to have one of our vessels captured by the enemy. So they decide to send in a special team led by 24-year-old Stephen Decatur. They had captured a 65-foot Barbary vessel, and they hired one of the locals to pilot it. And they filled the bottom with combustibles like cotton, whale oil, things that would catch fire really quick, because there's no way they could get that ship ready and take it out without being seen and captured. So while all of Tripoli was celebrating that night on their new ship they had gotten from the U.S., Stephen Decatur and his men sneak aboard the Philadelphia, lay down the combustibles, drip out lines of whale oil, start the fire, and then they run back out to get in the ship that's going to take them out safely to the harbor. And they don't know why they're not disconnecting from the vessel, because they've untied all the ropes, and now guards in the harbor spot them and see what they're doing, and they start shooting at them. Suddenly one guy sees a rope that was still tied to the boat, and he pulls out his sword and he just whacks it, and he cuts it, and the American vessel starts to slip away. And once it's a little bit distant, at about that time, the fire aboard the Philadelphia reaches its gunpowder stores, and a huge explosion rips the harbor, and the Americans were able to get away, all at the loss of only one man. Well, they change a Commodore because the first squadron commander wasn't doing that great. They switch Commodores again, and this new Commodore utilizes his 450 Marines to begin an assault on the Barbary towns. His men were able to scrape up a $637 out of their pay and get 150 Arab allies to attack like Derma, which was a city located right about there. And basically a naval bombardment combined with a land assault caused that town to fall. And basically they just do it to coastal towns, working their way up, working their way up, working their way up, until they march into Tripoli, and they get the bey or the ruler of the Barbary pirates to surrender to them. So they're all excited. Yeah, we forced them to surrender. And this is in 1805. They sail back to the United States only to discover that the Americans had signed a peace treaty with them in 1805, paying them $60,000 to ransom United States sailors that had been captured. And in return for this payment for captured sailors, basically the Barbary pirates put a halt on raids on American shipping. So America was able to get the Barbary pirates, even though it took us a long time, to do what none of the other European countries could. Now you ready to go to the next crisis? All right, next slide. The crisis in America's interior. Now, Jefferson was totally afraid that he's going to have conflict over France for America to secure access to the Mississippi River. Basically what had happened, remember, Napoleon is in Europe and he's taken over countries. Well, he took over Spain and he installed his brother as the prince and traded some of France's lands in southern Europe in return for the Louisiana Purchase, the lands that France had lost in North America. And we had signed our treaty that opened up the Mississippi River with Spain, not with France. And remember, in America, people had poured into those lands so they could use the Mississippi River or the rivers attached to it to get their goods to market. And people in America were really starting to get afraid that Napoleon might want to be building up a new world empire just like he had in France. I mean, Europe. Now, what proof did they have that Napoleon was trying to create a new world empire? Well, for that, we got to look at Haiti. Crisis in America's interior continued. Now, way back in 1791, Toussaint Louverture led a slave rebellion against the slave masters in Haiti. Now he was educated. His father was white. His mother was black. He knew how to read. he had read all the accounts of the revolution that was going on in France, and he believed that over here in the New World, that also, because he was French, he believed that the slaves also should have liberté, égalité, et fraternité. So they have a revolution against their former owners. But he orders his soldiers not to do them any harm. Don't kill the plantation owners if you can avoid it. Don't kill the mayor. Don't kill the doctors. Now, why would Toussaint have done this? Well, basically because those were the guys that possessed the knowledge. They knew how to run a plantation. They knew how to run a city. They knew how to heal people with their skills. Well, at first, Napoleon kind of gave lip service to Toussaint, making him feel like, oh yeah, we're allies. But in 1802, he dispatched an army to retake the island. Because remember, that was one of France's sugar islands that got France a lot of money. And basically, he sent more than 20,000 troops to dispose Toussaint and reinstitute slavery. One of the very first things they're able to do is capture Toussaint, and they execute him. Which is probably one of the worst things they could have done, because he was a guy who preached constraint. And while this war was going on, basically people in America got so worried. I mean, even like Jefferson announced that the day France takes possession, because basically they thought he's going to use Haiti as the center of his New World Empire, and then they're going to come up here back into North America, the mainland proper. Because they already had New Orleans, and Jefferson said that the day France takes possession of New Orleans, we must marry ourselves to the British fleet and nation. Because, guys, that was so crucial to the American settlements within the Mississippi River Valley. Ready to go to the next slide? So Jefferson sends two of our ambassadors, James Monroe and Livingston, and told them that they were going to offer to France $2 million just for the city of New Orleans. Because remember, that's at the mouth of the river, and if you control the mouth, you control the river. About $2 million was all we had, and we thought that we might get a chance at doing that. However, things happened. Monroe and Livingston met with Talleyrand, and basically that big military army that had gone to take over Haiti had been wiped out by both sickness and by the people of Haiti refusing to be slaves again. that the French expedition was wiped out. By the way, America was the first nation in the world that recognized Haiti as an independent nation. Meanwhile, in Europe, France's enemies were organizing against Napoleon. So now he needed money more than that land over there in North America. So Talleyrand tells Livingston and Monroe that he would sell all of the Louisiana Territory, the whole Louisiana Purchase, more than 830,000 square miles, that would more than double the size of the United States. He'd sell it to us for 15 million bucks. Oh, and before I go to the next slide, and by the way, even though they didn't have the money to pay for it, Monroe and Livingston said, yes, we're going to do it. And they tell Thomas Jefferson, hey, Jefferson, we got this deal. And Thomas Jefferson says, oh my gosh, yes, we'll do it. Now, he had to say that because Congress wasn't in session. It was Congress that actually had the power to come, because remember, the legislative branch has the power of the purse. But basically, Jefferson knew that he couldn't pass this deal up. Ready to go to the next slide? Because the Louisiana Purchase, just look at that huge amount of territory. It would, A, save us from an alliance with Britain. It would secure the Mississippi River for the United States. It would more than double our size. It eliminated a foreign threat from the continental U.S., and it provided all that new land for farmers. And remember, Thomas Jefferson wanted America to be an agricultural nation. But as I said, the only problem is it was outside of his powers to get all that land. Congress had the authority, not him. Ready to go to the next slide? But of course, guys, as soon as Congress did meet in November of 1803, they quickly ratified it because it was such an incredible deal. About the only people that were against it were Federalists from the Northeast. Because, of course, they were worried about losing political power as well as economic power, because a lot of their population would head out west. That about the only complaint they could really make was, well, he didn't have the power to do that. Ready to go to the next slide? Well, even before the ink was dry on the paper, Thomas Jefferson had organized a secret expedition, the Corps of Discovery, to explore the area, to find out who was out there, foreign agents, Indian tribes, rivers, strategic sites. Now, the Lewis and Clark expedition was made up of Meriwether Lewis, who was Jefferson's private secretary, and William Clark, the son of George Rogers Clark, a Revolutionary hero. They were to explore all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. And they were kind of given false papers because they were supposed to spy on everything. Now, Native Americans were crucial to the success of this expedition, especially a Native American woman by the name of Sacagawea. Now, Sacagawea had actually been born on the Pacific coast, but she'd been married, traded, everything like that, until she got to the other side throughout her life of the Rocky Mountains, and she was married to a French fur trapper named Charbonneau. Now, Sacagawea could speak all of these Native American languages and French. Charbonneau could speak French, Native American languages, some, and English. So whenever Lewis and Clark had a question, they had to ask Charbonneau, who in turn had to ask Sacagawea. She then would translate for the Native American groups and then pass the information back. Kind of like a huge game of telephone. But they sent back all of these scientific specimens, like groundhogs that Jefferson really loved. They took the measurements and sent back some specimens of like eagles, that these huge wingspan, the elks with the huge spread of the antlers that were much larger than the European counterparts. And of course, over here in America, we would say that the larger size was because even from the very ground itself, it nurtured liberty, which made things more powerful. So that's the Northern Expedition. Ready to go to the next slide? Now there was another expedition. This is Lewis and Clark up here in the red. There was another expedition that was sent out to explore the west, and it explores the south and comes back up. That was Zebulon Pike, who had been ordered by General James Wilkinson, Wilkenson, to go from Missouri to Colorado, then down to New Mexico. Where's my... Over here in Missouri, got to Colorado, where he found Pikes Peak. Then he was supposed to go down to Santa Fe in New Mexico and travel a little bit more. He gets captured by the Spanish and taken down to Mexico City, interrogated, and then returned back to Natchitoches in Louisiana. And of course, Zebulon Pike took lots of notes about the possibilities of trade. And remember that name of the guy who sent him, Zebulon Pike? James Wilkinson, because we're going to talk more about him next lecture. Ready to go to the next slide? Challenge and uncertainty in Jefferson's America. Okay, the heritage of partisan politics. Guys, Federalists found themselves in an incredibly weak position in the election of 1804. Jefferson's policies and achievements made the Republican Democrats exceedingly popular. Look, this is about one of their only arguments. Here's Thomas Jefferson as a prairie dog, and there's France with their territory, and here's the Hornet, which is Napoleon, that's stinging Jefferson, just making him vomit up money for the territory we got. Because they paid too much for it. Ready to go to the next slide? Now, what could Jefferson fight back with? Guys, what Jefferson did was incredible. He basically eliminated internal taxes. He encouraged westward migration. He eliminated the hated Alien and Sedition Acts. He gave hope of a bright future to many of the kids that were born after we had won the Revolutionary War in kind of a baby boom. His laissez-faire approach to industry continued the growth of our industry, and many in international commerce had amassed fortunes. Basically, he had built up a multi-million-dollar surplus, all without raising taxes. Ready to go to the next slide? Westward expansion and social stress. Well, guys, the West attracted huge numbers of settlers, giving rise in turn to new anxiety. The huge and unprecedented growth of the region made many people worried. Like I told you, most of the kids that were born out of the revolutionary baby boom were moving out west. Because there were less people in the coast, a lot of Eastern businessmen were fearing a decline in their political influence and profits. Why would they make less profits? Well, because they have less people to sell to. And not only that, but now that there's less people to sell to, there's less people that you can have as employees. So you're going to have to pay them more. So you got a rise in labor costs. Meanwhile, if you're out west, then you're really trying to struggle to absorb the newcomers and keep peace with the local Native American peoples. Okay. Ready to go to the next slide? Meanwhile, the Western economy was very problematic. I mean, exporting produce proved expensive because of the country's limited transportation routes. I mean, it was almost impossible. For example, say you rented space on a barge and took your goods all the way down the Mississippi River. Well, that was cheap, but it was so expensive to try to fight against the current and take that barge back upstream that in New Orleans, basically they'd dismantle the barge and sell it for lumber because it was cheaper. And you had to take like the Natchez Trail back up north. Basically that was a road / footpath built out of like old animal trails and paths used by Native Americans. Meanwhile, if you lived up in the north, you could use the St. Lawrence Seaway to get your stuff in, but its current once again was so powerful that you couldn't really take it back out. And not only that, but Canada was owned by Britain, which was right on the other shore, so it might be enemy territory. And the ebb and flow of new settlers coming out to your place, because most of the settlers would be there, stay for a little while, and then move on, led to an economic unpredictability. So basically they had to work to keep the interest of settlers coming through their town. Ready for the next slide? Now we had economic unpredictability, but you also had social instability, because most of these communities were settled by young men, meaning that the Western communities were not orderly, because basically they were out there to start their future. Their interest was in building a farm. So, you know, they bought whatever land they could. Their neighbor would buy whatever land they could. They'd make whatever roads they could, etc. Meanwhile, in the East, the young were achieving independence at an earlier age, because now they could just head out west and start their own farm. They didn't have to stay at home, which meant that parents had less control over their children, and their children were marrying off and leaving home, which is a huge social change. Well, how do Americans normally react to social change? Well, they usually turn to religion. And it's interesting because what religions were used in the different sections of society kind of showed the way that society was going. Like rationalism, which culminated in Unitarianism, was very popular in the Northeast. You know, they had a very deist view of God. And they stressed individual freedom of belief and like rejected the Trinity. I mean, they kept the moral principles of Christianity and disregarded anything supernatural, because it breaks natural law. And according to enlightened thinking, it's not a good thing to break natural law. Indeed, you had like Thomas Paine calling Christianity the strangest religion ever set up. It committed a murder upon Jesus in order to redeem mankind from eating an apple. Unitarianism became so popular that it captured control of Harvard College, a college that had been founded by the Puritans to make sure to maintain strict orthodoxy. It threw out things like predestination, and a lot of the young people really liked the spiritual empowerment that Unitarianism offered. Meanwhile, what's going on in the South and West? Well, in the South and West, they're turning evangelicals. These are groups like the Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, and even evangelical Congregationalists. They called for a religious awakening that had begun out in Cane Ridge, Kentucky in 1801, where 20 to 30,000 people of all ages, representing various cultures and economic levels, traveled out there, and they had a huge revival meeting where they basically wanted to reinstate God's vision for America, basically to spread His word, which encouraged spreading the word out to the unknown areas. And guys, remember, that's what the guys in the South and West were doing. They were expanding out into land they had never seen before. So it's kind of like they were doing God's will. Ready for the next slide? Well, what happened to non-whites in Jefferson's America? Well, Jefferson believed that whites were superior to blacks. He believed that African Americans were inferior to whites in the endowments of body and mind. Now, this is despite the achievements of Benjamin Banneker, a celebrated mathematician, engineer, and surveyor. He had helped to design the original city plans for Washington, D.C. And Jefferson stated to Banneker, "Nobody wishes more than I do to see such proofs as you exhibit, that nature has given to our black brethren talents equal to those of other colors of men." However, he believed that Banneker's excellence was evidence of his moral eminence rather than his intellectual equality. Now, in the North during this time, many blacks undertook to develop their own institutions, especially as the number of free blacks increased after 1790. And even though they were freed, they were systematically excluded from white society. So they started building their own institutions, like the African Methodist Episcopal churches, with Richard Allen forming the Bethel Church for Negro Methodists in 1793. Two years later, he became the first deacon ordained in America and formed his own African Methodist Episcopalian branch in 1816. And as you can guess, his churches developed. They started their own educational and as well as other institutions, joining together with denominations like Presbyterians, Baptists, and others. And beyond providing schools, they launched the first African American magazine in America and formed their own college, Wilberforce University. Ready to go to the next slide? Well, what about Native Americans? Well, Jefferson regarded American Indians as inferior to whites, not as inferior to whites, rather as culturally backward. And services developed by his administration aimed to transmit white culture to them, because Jefferson believed that the more exposed they were to white culture, the more they'd want to join in. The only problem, though, is that until acculturation was complete, the Indians needed to be protected. Basically, they were to be treated as children, as they didn't know how to use their rights and responsibilities. Now, the problem with looking down on some of the Native Americans like this is the accomplishments of some Native American groups. For example, like the Creeks, the Cherokee, had begun to centralize and build their own economies. Like Alexander McGallivray of the Creeks played American, French, and Spanish interests off of each other brilliantly. Making a lot of money for his tribe and building a strong community, complete with its own privately owned plantations. So the Creeks had slaves, but also so did the Cherokee elite, who had done the same thing, and in 1794 had established a central power. Handsome Lake of the Iroquois, he wanted his tribal children to go to the Indian schools, use European farming techniques, tools, and live in European-style houses. But he also wanted them to avoid the witchcraft of alcohol. Now, as they were prospering, nearby whites didn't like this, and they regarded these developments as impediments to their own westward expansion. So, fearing conflict, Jefferson encouraged the Native Americans to move further west. You know, we're just going to keep these guys apart until that acculturation is complete. And the problem with this is this whole idea of segregating Native Americans became the basis of Indian policy for the rest of the century. All right, guys, that's it for this lecture. During next lecture, we're going to be talking about the president that follows, Jefferson, and a little thing known as the War of 1812.